When I look around Melbourne, what I observe today is that Marxism seems to be very popular, particularly around inner city areas with young people and with some of the wealthy middle-aged. But what I find is that typically when I speak to these people, they not only believe the claims of Marxism, but they want Marxism to have absolute power. They're not contented for the left to remain as a political option in comparison to the right. They want absolute control. And in of itself, this might not seem like a problem. If you sit and read the claims that Marxists make about themselves and make about Marxism, it seems like a wondrous thing that anybody ought to want. I mean, everyone being free, everyone being equal, it sounds lovely in theory. The problem I have with Marxism is that I come from a very different direction. I don't need to read the literature, and the little I have read only confirms the things that I already know. You see, my family, parts of it grew up under the Chinese Communist Revolution. So for my family and for the stories they've told me, Marxism is not a question of theory, it is a question of practice. And even within my experiences of China itself, I've been able to see that while communist rule is not entirely unlivable, it cannot produce the quality of life and freedom that I think most of us in the West would not only take for granted, but expect from a change of government. A lot of people, I think, who are after Marxism, they seem to believe that if Marxism became normal, we really would achieve a fairer, more just society. This is not what Marxism actually produces. This is what Marxism promises, so that you will give it power. And then once it is in power, the result is very different. Let me tell you a personal story about one of the things that happened to my mother's family under communist rule. Because the government took away the ability for even the wealthiest of families to have one parent remain at home while the other worked, both of my grandparents had to go to work, which meant that my mother and aunt, who were very, very young, maybe infants, well, my mother would have been about 3 years old, my aunt would have been either a baby or maybe not even born yet, but, they had to be left in the care of a nanny. And the first nanny my mother had was like a mother to her. She was kind and caring. My mother would tell me the story of how, as a toddler, she tripped over a stool and started crying, and the nanny came and beat the stool and said, "Bad stool for hurting Hong, bad stool," and comforted my mother. And so my mother adored this woman. But because the Marxist regime in China made the whole country so poor, there was a point at which my grandparents had to sit and have a conversation about whether or not they could afford to keep the nanny on. And unfortunately, the nanny overheard this. And again, because China was so impoverished at this point, she couldn't simply say to herself, well, I'll just get another job. There was a very real likelihood that it would have condemned her and her family to poverty. So she took her own life. Now, this in of itself might not seem like that big of a deal. I mean, my mother was very young at the time, only about 3, and so presumably people could have simply told her that the nanny went away. But no, this is not what occurred. I think one of the testaments to the brutality of the Red Police of the Chinese Communist Revolution is that they had my mother ID the body as a 3-year-old child. They had her ID that body of what was a mother to her. And you must understand, in all of my mother's life, this is the only person who ever truly made her feel cared for. And to this day, she's traumatized, Throughout my childhood, what my mother told me over and over again is never love anyone, because they'll go away. Now, this isn't even the only story of tragedy I could tell. As my mother was growing up a little older, Actually, this isn't even the end of the story. Because that nanny was gone, my grandparents had to hire another nanny. This nanny was cruel and merciless to my mother and aunt. And, but she was what my grandparents could afford under such poverty. And she used to treat my mother and aunt so mercilessly that they are still traumatized. They're still quite emotionally stolid and merciless people themselves. That nanny used to do things like eating all of the flesh of a banana and only leaving my aunt and my mother the peel to eat. Things like that. And, some of it my mother and aunt can't even talk to me about. They can't even really tell me what happened. That's how bad it really was. And this isn't even all that happened, As a child, my mother also had a beloved dog, a beloved Chow Chow. But again, poverty in China was so bad under communist rule that the neighbors took her dog and ate it. That is how poor they were, that they had to steal a little girl's dog from her and eat it. And again, that dog, she loved it, and it was taken from her and eaten. And all of these tragedies, this is just the tip of the iceberg of the horrors that went on under communist rule. And yet there are people in this country who think, give us communism and our lives will get better. No, that's not how this works. Communism promises you everything, just like any other politician really. They make all of these outlandish promises. But the difference between communist rule and any of the other political parties you could choose in in Australia, is that at the very least, all the other parties have a priori interest in maintaining the democratic process. If you have a leader and they're awful, you can just vote them out and get a different one in who isn't as awful. Under communist rule, this is not what happens. You lose the right to vote. You might argue, well, China claims you can vote. There are other socialist nations that claim you can vote. But if you look into it more deeply, that's a mirage. That's a veneer. They don't really let you vote. And then I've tried talking to Marxists here in Melbourne about this, telling them about the horrors that happened to my family. And not only even if they do care, and very often they're very apathetic, but even where they do care, they say, oh, it wasn't true communism then, which is ridiculous. That is a ridiculous claim, because if you go and read the texts of Marx himself, he says himself that it is fair enough to use violence to move to advance the cause of Marxism forward. Even he condones violence against anybody who stands in the way of Marxism. Can't you see the very fact that they are willing to use violence, they're actually willing to kill people in the name of this objective, proves that they don't really care about the sanctity of human life. They don't care about protecting people. They don't really care about helping anyone. What they care about is advancing their cause. And their cause is hostile to many of the basic freedoms that we take for granted in our society as part of what makes us human. And you might want to argue, and they do argue this, well, this isn't China, this is Australia. If Marxism came here, it would be different. Well, take a look at just about every other nation where communism has become the norm. Look, there is a list you can go to of nations on Wikipedia, and you can look into what is actually going on in each of those nations. And everywhere you look, it's similar stories over and over again of, communism being instated in these places maybe 40 or 50 years ago, but then they work out to be just like North Korea, or there's such extreme government corruption that leading a normal life under their rule is impossible. And even where that's not the case, you can say, oh, but what about China? They're very wealthy. Take a look at what they've been doing to Tibet since as far back as around the Second World War. Like, there is... it's very easy to believe what Marxism claims about itself. But that's the thing. They only show their true face after you've given them absolute power. They only show their true corruption at that point. And you might say, well, I'm smart. I know better. As soon as I see the corruption, I will pull back my support. Don't you think China could have gone that same way? Don't you think Cuba could have? Don't you think any of the African nations that are now, don't you think Algeria could have gone that way? But no. Part of what happens under communism is that the local population becomes so impoverished and so weak and so malnourished, literally malnourished. There were phases under the communist rule in China where people were so impoverished they couldn't get the food they needed just to survive. There were millions of people who died just because Mao insisted upon his way. And but that's the way this goes. They starve you until you're unable to fight for yourself, and then you can't fight back. You can't get rid of them, even if you want to. And even if you do have the strength, they have all of these other people who have been brainwashed into believing that their cause is just, and they will come and they will kill you for opposing them. This is what happens every time. If you can find a place where communist rule has definitively worked out to be better for a nation than democracy, then good for you. Good for that concept. But even then, I would invite you to take a moment to look at what might be making that situation different from all of the many, many different nations where communist rule has gone horribly, horribly wrong for the local population. And that's just the local population. Remember what China did and continues to do to Tibet, and then pay attention to the fact that they've only just started behaving the same way towards America and other nations because now they have enough economic power to do so. And they don't have that economic power to be freely distributed. There are still people living in poverty in China. There are. There are still people who are living with a lack of education in China, or at least sufficient education that they could advance their lives forward in a meaningful way. I mean, yes, people are probably more wealthy in China than they were 50, 60 years ago, but at what cost? At what cost? Because much of that wealth has been built on the back of sweatshop workers. Much of that is built on the back of exploitative labor over minority groups who cannot speak for themselves. And it's not just Tibet. If you look into what's going on in China, there is a lot of horrible things happening to all sorts of people. And what's really scary is that just for the simple fact of saying it, this is a testament to what Chinese communism does. For the simple fact of my sitting here saying this, I'm putting my life at risk. I'm in danger because I'm verbally expressing all of these things. So, if yes, your government may be imperfect here in Australia. It may be. But at the very least, you have the freedom to say that they are. You have the freedom to say that without having to worry that somebody might come and kill you while you sleep. That's a reality. That's a reality that I wish that sometimes that I had the ability to beam all of my knowledge and experience into the head of other people, because if they could just see what I have, they would understand why their way doesn't work. They would understand why it doesn't work to try to make other people do things your way. Why democracy has worked so well as it has in Australia for such a long time. And yes, we are not innocent. There are things in Australia that have gone horribly wrong as well. But the difference is that we're repentant. We're sorry that we did horrible things to the Aboriginals. We're sorry that we were a racist nation for a very long time. China is not sorry for what they're doing to Tibet. They're not sorry for all of their corruption. They're proud of it. And they will... Even before all of the most recent trouble, had you gone to China, you would have seen that a remarkable number of websites were blocked in China. That is a testament to how authoritarian they truly are. And certainly you could argue, well, some Marxists are libertarian. Well, if you're that libertarian, why are you trying to get an entire country to think exactly the same way as you? The fact that you are trying to get everybody else to do things your way, however libertarian you might think you are, proves that you are not libertarian. It proves that you are authoritarian, and it proves that you are part of a violent regime that unless you stop it, unless you're willing to say no at some point, is going to get increasingly violent and aggressive. That is the way Marxism always goes. And there are people on the other side of this who will say, well, Australia has its own military. They have the support of America. They have, you know, even if there are a number of people in Australia who decide to try to become, who try to fight for some sort of Marxist revolution here and now, there are things that can be done to protect people if it becomes violent. That's great to say in theory, but even within Australian borders, there have been people mysteriously disappearing after they publicly spoke out against China. That much is true. Look into it. You know, it's... I feel sad because China is one of my ancestral lands. You know, I'm proud to be half Chinese. I'm proud that that's part of my background and culture. And to know that I have blood relatives who are living without basic freedoms, such as freedom of press, such as freedom of expression, such as freedom of religion, to me that's horrifying. And yes, you could argue, well, that's not true. In China there are churches. Sure, there are churches, but look at how tightly they are controlled. Even if you want to go over there and start your own church, you need to gain levels of government approval that you wouldn't need anywhere else. And I've met Aussies who say, oh, well, that's fine, I'd rather have no religion. That's very easy for you to say. You still live in a country where if you want to be part of a religion, you can choose to. That's very different from living in a country where you have to think exactly what the government tells you to for you to be acceptable. And it's not just about Christianity. They will condemn Wiccans in the same manner. They will condemn Buddhists in the same manner. They will condemn every single religious tradition that falls outside of what they consider acceptable. And even what they accept, they force to behave as though it is venerating the Chinese government. The last time I was in China, I saw this massive, beautiful Buddhist temple, and it looked like it had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and yet for some reason there was a great big TV screen hanging from the front of it, venerating the ruler of China, venerating its leader. That should not be. That is not freedom of religion. Your religion, to be acceptable, should not have to worship the government. You shouldn't be forced to worship the government. Like that why would your government demand that of you? What's going on there is that they're not giving you even the basic freedom to use your own mind to believe what you really believe in. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what you lose once communism becomes commonplace.